reflection. What can I do better? How do I improve on that? You can then go forward. A full stop, if you think of it in reading a sentence, you stop. There's nothing after that. Whereas a comma just says, take a breath. You see yourself as a victim. That's not fair. That's not right. You did this to me. I feel cheated. If you have high levels of self-efficacy, you go, this is on me. What can I do?
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This one you're going to love. I promise you're going to love. Professor Damian Hughes is a professor of organizational psychology and change, an international speaker, and a best-selling author. He combines his practical and academic background within sport, organizational development, and change psychology to help organizations and teams create a high-performing culture. He's written 8 books, 8. 8 books, that's crazy, 8 books about the psychology of high performance, teams, culture, leaders, and change. And he draws on cutting edge research to explain how we can all learn the secrets of high performance. Damian has served as a member of the coaching team for England's Rugby League, Scotland's Rugby Union, and a wide range of international and national sporting teams. He's also the co-host of the really successful High Performance podcast, an acclaimed series of interviews with elite performers from business, sports, and the arts, exploring the psychology behind sustained high performance. So there are few people who are better placed than Damian to teach us the psychology of a winning mindset, creating high performance habits and becoming the best possible you and sustaining success. I said it at the top of this show. I'm going to tell you right now, you do not want to miss this. Thanks for tuning in. Let's cue the music. Well, Damian, thank you for coming to join us on the podcast today. And look, I've wanted to get you on the show for a while because I just think you think a little bit different to other people. And I've noticed when people ask you questions about teams, performance, psychology, getting the best out of yourself, you give really detailed answers. And that comes from my understanding of the amount of research that you've done over the years into all of the successful teams and even businesses that exist out there. Now, I've got a million questions to ask you today. And some of them you're going to be, I've answered that one before. But that's please for the benefit of the audience. There's some people that have asked me to ask you some questions. So please allow that. But first of all, you started off as a kid from Manchester whose dad was I think your dad was a boxing trainer, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
As this young kid that was around the kind of inner cities and around people where discipline was the thing in boxing, wasn't it? Discipline, discipline and dedication and focus. What kind of an upbringing was that like for you?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I said to you off air, it was a real privilege and an honour to be asked, and I mean it, and I want to repeat that on air. So thank you for the kind invite. And thanks for the kind opening question. My background is probably a bit eclectic, I suppose. That I often use the line to people that I grew up in a boxing gym, which is true because my dad was a boxing coach and he'd founded a boxing gym long before myself and my siblings were born. Now, if anyone's listening to this that's got sort of like an image in their head of a sort of a traditional boxing gym in the States or in the UK, they probably see it in sort of like some gritty inner city area. And that was certainly the case where I was brought up. So there's no badge of honour in this, but the area was categorised a number of years ago as being one of the third poorest in Europe. And that gives the reason I mention that is that gives a good indication of the kind of social issues that blighted the community. So like unemployment, gang culture, drug culture, some of the crime and things like that. But the boxing gym that my dad had founded was almost like an oasis in the middle of some of these difficult circumstances. So it was seen as a place where you could go to, where you could be seen, you'd be heard, and you'd be respected. But in return for that, there was a demand that if you came into that environment, there was a certain level of respect and discipline that you had to do and you had to give. So a really simple example to explain it, Spencer, is that you weren't allowed to swear within that boxing gym. You weren't allowed to come in there and use profane or bad language. And it wasn't a moral judgment that was being applied. It was a message that discipline counted. So if you couldn't come into that environment and use anything other than F words or C bombs, that showed a lack of discipline. And in a boxing ring, a lack of discipline was going to cost you dearly. So there was factors like that that were really important in terms of you always had to shake each other's hand. So regardless of whether you had an issue or whether there was any sort of kind of bubbling rivalry going on, there was always a level of respect that you had to look each other in the hand, shake the hand, and say hello in those environments and things like that. Now, it's only as I've got older that when I went down the academic route, I remember one of my lecturers using a phrase that said, "We don't do research, we do me search," where we often try and make sense of our own lives. And again, it's like that old Kierkegaard quote that life only makes sense when you look backwards, but you've just got to live it forward. And I think as I've gone forward in my life and I look backwards, I start to see how powerful that those formative years were, especially in terms of shaping the work that I do, which is very much around shaping cultures, creating high performing teams and cultures. And so much of it was being taught to me as a young boy within that boxing gym.
Now, tell me about your relationship with your dad.
Yeah.
What kind of a man was he? Because I can imagine the stereotypical boxing gym kind of guy, kind of grey sweatpants, kind of in their small office out the back, tough but kind. Put his arms around kids when he could see they come from a challenging background, or they might have had a tough time at home. But what was it like, being the son of that man?
Yeah, so I mean, it's quite a moving question really, because my dad passed away at the end of January. So to talk about him feels like a real privilege to honour his memory. He was an incredible man. I mean, his own story was incredible. So he came from he was an illegitimate child, and he was born in a Catholic post-war Manchester. Now, the reason I mention that fact is that being an illegitimate child in that sort of Catholic community always made him a bit of an outsider. There was a real stigma attached to it. So he pursued boxing himself, but because he never had a father figure, he found himself, it's a sport that will take advantage of people when they're vulnerable in many ways. And that's what happened to him, that he got himself badly hurt, he was overmatched. But those two factors actually shaped his own life. So he became a father figure to thousands of other people within the community. So one of his drivers was to treat people with the respect and the kindness and the sense of belonging that he'd never had in his own background. And the irony was he went into the sport that had caused him a lot of pain and hurt himself, and tried to take those same principles into that sport. So he was incredible. That he was an illiterate as well. So when he'd left school, for the little bit of schooling he had, he couldn't read or write. But he taught himself to read or write and became an author that wrote a number of books that he used to raise funds for the boxing club that he grew up in. He trained guys that went on to win Olympic medals and to become world champions, and he taught himself how to do that. So I was around somebody that had that can-do attitude, that they weren't a victim of their circumstances. They were somebody that still took real agency over what life had dealt with them and worked out how could they be the best that they could. And I think what always intrigued me, and the lessons that I got from my dad, Spencer, was that the way I phrase it now is, it was the work that's done in the shadows always reveals itself in the light. So he was humble, but he was ferocious in his work appetite. He was ferocious in terms of his attention to detail. He was ferocious in the fact that he always wanted us to behave with decency and humility and kindness towards others, and he'd seize on it if we didn't. So I'll give you a couple of neat stories about him, but the one that really resonated for me was that when I was I boxed. So he wanted me and my brothers to learn how to box And when I was about 13, I was in the boxing ring with a guy that very quickly it emerged that I was better than him. Now, in my dad's gym, the rule in a situation like that was that you don't that you take the opportunity there to coach the guy that you might be better in. So you're teaching yourself by teaching somebody else. This is how you slip a punch. This is where you should be moving. So an opportunity like that was seen as a coaching opportunity. But I was a 13-year-old idiot and didn't take that opportunity. And I instead abused the power dynamic in that situation. So I took advantage of the guy I was in a ring with. And I mean, I'm trying to explain it in a decent way, but in very blunt terms, I behaved like a bit of a bully. And I took advantage of it. And as I was getting out of the ring after the sparring session, I was feeling pretty pleased with myself. And my dad came over and just said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Oh, I've finished training." He said, "Oh, you haven't?" He said, "That really wasn't a workout. Stay in the ring for a bit longer." And what he did was he put a far more experienced boxer in the ring with me. And he made us do 3 rounds together. And for the next 9 minutes, I endured what I'd still describe as one of the greatest humiliations of my life. That this guy just made me look like, didn't physically hurt me, but just taught me a lesson about humility and kindness and decency, but did it in a way that made me look incredibly stupid while the whole gym and my peers and people I grew up with stood and enjoyed watching me get served that slice of humble pie. And as I got out of the ring, I remember I was trying my best to hold back tears. And my dad came over and said, "How are you feeling?" And I couldn't say anything because I thought if I speak, I'll cry. And my dad just said to me quietly, he said, "How you feel now is exactly what you did to that other boy 10 minutes ago." And his point was, he said, "Don't ever, ever bully anybody again." Now, I'm telling that story 35 years later, and it still makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But they're the kind of experiences that are incredibly formative. That, like, if I'm ever tempted now to sort of abuse a power dynamic in any context, the first image that flashes into my head, my emotional brain, puts that image of those feelings right in front of my eyes, and it very quickly sort of grounds you and says, "Just know your place. Don't be a dick in so many ways." And so I just feel so privileged that I had the opportunity to grow up in that environment, and privileged to have a father as special as I had.
Sounds like quite a man.
Yeah, he was. I mean, another story that gives some kind of testimony to him was that about 4 years ago, Manchester Council chose to name a road in honour of him because of the impact that it had in such a poor blighted area of Manchester. And on the day of the announcement or the unveiling of the road name, I'd estimate there was about 300 people turned up to come and just pay tribute to it. And I remember being with my brothers and looking around, and we tried to work it out. And I think a conservative estimate, 80% of the people that showed up that day had never set foot in a boxing ring. And the reason I mention that is that people wanted to come because although it was a boxing gym he ran, it was actually a community hub. So you didn't need to step into a boxing ring to come and be a member there. You could still come and find sanctuary from the challenges of life outside, and you'd still be treated with respect and decency and consideration. And that they made up the vast majority of the people that came along. And what a lot of them spoke about was how that, like my dad and the culture it shaped had such a seminal impact on them as people, as partners, as parents, and as profession in a wide range of other professions that they'd done. So I was lucky enough to almost see the mechanics that went in behind it, which is why I feel in many ways that the nature of the work I do is almost like passing that legacy on, like the legacy of the great work that I had that, if you'll forgive the pun, a ringside seat to observe. I feel that if you can help people understand how they can do similar in their own places, whether that's in sort of an organisation, a workplace, or whether it's in a sports team, or whether it's in a sort of social setting, if you can sort of show how culture can be a competitive advantage, that's how. I mean, that's a very big driver for me in the nature of the work that I do.
You studied, you're a professor. Academia clearly was something that you leaned into at an early age.
Well, not
And
really. No, so again, like, sorry to interrupt you, but I actually struggled with academia quite early on. So I was fortunate enough. I got a scholarship to a school, so I had a natural aptitude, and my dad was keen to push me down the route of going down academia rather than feeling that like physical work, especially using my fists, was important. But but from the background I was from, I went to a school where I didn't know anybody. So I went to a big school where I was the only kid um, that I knew that was going there. And I felt like a fish out of water, if I'm honest, Spencer, that I really struggled. And for the first 3 years, the only way I knew how to do it was to fall back on some of those instincts that I demonstrated when I was in that boxing ring and took advantage. So I'd get myself in lots of scrapes. I'd sort of, I felt if anyone wronged me, I was quick with my fists. And what happened for me was that I got expelled eventually. The school that were sort of giving me a scholarship to go there just got fed up with what they saw as me sort of not being grateful or being a little bit disingenuous. So they expelled me. And I remember sort of the day that I got expelled, knowing what the reaction was going to be at home, that my mum and dad were going to be crestfallen. And what I was incredibly blessed by was that, and this image didn't fit, I was an altar boy at the local Catholic church at the same time as being this tearaway. And a teacher from my school had been in and seen me on the altar about 6 months before. And I knew he couldn't compute the two images. He had this guy that was looking holier than thou on the altar, and yet coming into school and would be throwing my fists around at the first sign of feeling aggrieved. And on the night I got expelled, this teacher, a man called Bernard Council, turned up to see my mum and dad. And when he got speaking to them, I think he sensed that they were good people and I was from a good family. And they saw how devastated I was. And this man went back to school and spoke up for me and persuaded the school to rescind it or to downgrade it to a suspension on the understanding that I was going to book my ideas up. So it took me quite a while to sort of get into the world of education or academia. And I've never felt particularly intelligent. What I felt is that I've pursued interests and sort of worked really hard at trying to learn things that really intrigue me. But I'm not a natural academic, if that makes sense, is the point I suppose I'm trying to make.
And that would give lots of hope to people out there that struggle with that as well, because typically, somebody becomes I don't know, they get a degree, they get a master's, they go on to become a professor. That's usually, people are pigeonholed, aren't they? It's just that, you must be good at studying if you can move into that category. You're clearly good at studying, boy, type of thing. So you can move into that area. So for you not to naturally fit into there, but working hard to get somewhere from it, says a lot about your character, and obviously a lot about what you were actually deeply interested in.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people kind of like move through different parts of study, even in their working lives as well, doing something and kind of having to be interested or having to be committed to something that it really doesn't serve their soul or serve their heart. So clearly this was an area for you that was just something that you were fascinated by.
Yeah, it was. So, I mean, that's a really astute point that you're making, Spencer. I think that I was intrigued at it from a really young age because I I would see that work in the shadows, that phrase that I used earlier. So I'd see the stuff that would go on. So I've never been sort of impressed by the bright lights of a performance. So say, for example, in the world I grew up in, seeing the guys fighting for a world title was never the thing that really blindsided me because I'd been fortunate enough to see the 4 months of a training camp that nobody would ever see, like they're having to get up early in the morning and do the road work. I'd see the hours of studying an opponent, the sort of weeks spent in the gym, sweating to get yourself to a physical state so you could execute a game plan. So all of that had always been the bit that had really got me excited and understood how do you do that better? How do you engage people to want to come on that journey with you? Was the bit that that had always intrigued me. And I also saw the loneliness of it for lots of leaders or coaches. I'd seen how lonely and how thankless and how demanding the task was. And again, another thing that inspired me was how do you be a friend to them? How do you sort of be that support or that coach for the coaches that are working under that kind of intense scrutiny and pressure? So they were the two things. And then I almost, based on that instinct, it was how do I find a way of complementing what really intrigues me to be able to put in place the framework or the tools or learn the messages that can aid them. So there was a real sense of purpose behind what about the choices that I'd made. But I think that's a really astute point you're making, that I think for anyone listening to this, it's about finding the thing that you are passionate about, the thing where you feel you can make a difference. You know, like we were talking off air before about the program that you're recording at the moment, and I was asking you, what have you learned? And it's the fact that you can almost tell the story of hope in many ways. You're going into fairly bleak situations, but you're taking away from that a message of hope and survival. And I think whenever you hear anyone that's gone on and achieved anything significant or something that, or somebody that they would say is happy with their choices, it's often a sense of purpose that lies at the heart of it.
It's interesting you say that. It takes me back to thinking about what motivated me in life.
Yeah.
Was, parents got divorced when I was young. Dad went bankrupt. School dinners, free school dinners, all that usual stuff. And I was bullied quite badly at school.
Right.
And I know the kids' names to this very day: Justin Zimmerman and Paul Fowler. Paul Fowler, red hair; Justin, blonde hair. Never forget them. And for the best part of, I left school at 16. So the best part of 30 years after that, they actually were my motivation.
Right.
So I had something to prove to them in some way, somehow, continually, all the way through. And people say, where'd you get your drive from? And it would always lean back to them. But it also leans into, and I think this is why this whole TV show matters to me, because I don't like people being treated badly.
Yep.
And I find it something really, really difficult to process. And so it takes me to a place where I want to kind of defend them, or I want to fight for them, or I want to champion them, or I want to protect them. Maybe all of those things in a small way, and all because of that. What happened to me when I was at school as a kid, that's kind of come through my life. And whilst I'm not trying to prove anything to the bullies anymore, I don't think anyone should be treated badly. And I had a really difficult dilemma actually with one of my daughters, because my eldest is tough as old boots. You as much as look at her the wrong way, she'll have you up against the wall.
And how old she, Spence?
She's 22 now, just finishing university.
Yep.
And my youngest is 19. She's at uni now. But she was bullied from about 5 or 6 years old. Okay, picked on, we call it, in the early days, and then it got to bullying. And my wife at the time wanted to speak to the school. And I was in this kind of dilemma where could she turn bullying into something that could really help her perform in the future? Could she use it as the pain was so great that it made her went, I'll show you? And so I was stuck between this, wanting to protect her because she's my little girl, okay, but also going, actually, this might be good for her after my experience, because if she gets out of it what I got out of it, maybe it was worth the pain.
Yeah. That's that's a fascinating point. That there was a study done on this by the British Olympic Association a few years ago. They published a paper called "Trauma to Triumph," and what they were asking was that what they found is that a high percentage of British Olympians had endured some kind of trauma in their early years. Now, whether that's a trauma of a parent's divorcing or a death, or even like what I think they call it small t trauma in terms of bullying or unkindness at school, is still a trauma. But if the lessons are unpicked in the right way, so it doesn't become encoded as some kind of victim mentality or shit always happens to me. But instead you go, you know what, I survived that. And this is what I learned about resilience and toughness and standing on my own 2 feet. They found that there was a high percentage of people that went on to achieve success within that sort of Olympic domain had gone through it. So I think the questions that you were asking about your daughter are really astute and apposite.
When we think about things in business, we see, I don't know, let's take actors when they start becoming, whether it's Hollywood, wherever it is, they go for lots of auditions and they face a lot of rejection and some give up. And in business, most people that start a business end up failing because they have to deal with lots of rejection and they give up. And I'm sure when you're a young, gifted sports person, you've got to fight your way into being selected, whether that's into the team or into the squad or even to get yourself a chance. And you're going to face pushback. Yeah. So you've got to raise your game. You've got to deliver your best each and every time. Or what most people do, sadly, is actually give up, don't they? They that's what happens to most people in society. But the ones that just keep going get there. When I first started in business, I was a salesperson. Right. Well, I wasn't. I was taught to be a salesperson. And my boss on the first day, my job, I was 18 years old, and it was to go knocking on doors in London and go make some cold calls. Wow. And so this was the job. I had to go and collect 100 compliment slips from 100 companies. I used to have to come back at lunchtime. I could get a coffee and a sandwich from the petrol station, then to the office, and I used to have to make 100 cold calls from those compliment slips. Now, my boss said to me on the first day, after we'd had our week's training and whatnot, he said, what I want you to do now is you're going to get on the phone and I want you to find 100 people to tell you no. All right? So you're going to make 100 calls, go and get 100 no's for me. And I was like, is he being serious? But I did as told. So every person I phoned up, they went, no. There was some swore at me, whatever it might be. No. Went through the afternoon, got all these no's, went to see the boss at 5:30. I said, I've got those 100 no's. He went, epic. He jumped out of his chair, gave me a high five. He said, I'll see you tomorrow. And so I went home going, oh, cool. Next day, he said the same thing. Get me 100 no's. Don't worry about anything. Just get me 100 no's. I was like, okay. So did it again, got another high five. Then the next day, he said to me, what I want you to do today is I only want you to get 99 no's. So just get 99. Go find 99 no's. And I want you to find one yes. All right. So you're going to need to get 99 no's before you get a yes. So just beware. Okay. That's what you're going to need to do. And so he was teaching me, obviously, you know what he was teaching me, but for the benefit of the audience, he was teaching me to understand that rejection was part of success. And he was doing it in a very practical sense, which the way that I learn, it needs to be practical. I don't learn theoretically. I need to be practically there. And so over the course of a few weeks, I was taught that I could not succeed. Success was impossible unless you sucked in, pursued, searched, went chasing after rejection to start with. And so rejection felt like nothing to me. Rejection felt like success. Rejection felt like, well, you need
brilliant.
If I was standing in the pub with my pint of snake bite, I'd be standing there going, no, you got, I need my 99 no's. What, are you mad? Of course you need 99 no's. And obviously other guys in the pub will be looking at me like I'm an idiot. But that whole thing about, about being successful in sports, in business, or whatever it is, and we're going to come on to this because you're a master at this subject matter. But for me, it's like, if you can teach people to pursue rejection and normalize rejection in a really, really practical, simple, yes, time-consuming initially way, then you can help them find success. And so here's how the numbers work before I pass over to you. It was 99 no's to 1 yes, so 1 in 100, yeah? Then it went 98 to 2 yeses. Well, it didn't go from 99 to 1 to 99 to 2. 98 to 2. It went from 99 to 1 to 49 to 1.
Brilliant. Okay.
And then it went, and they said, right, I want you to get 96 no's. I want you to get 4 yeses. Well, that actually was 1 in 25. Yeah. And so it was teaching me to understand that actually getting 96 no's and 4 yeses is really good because it's 1 in 25. And slowly as my skills developed and my understanding that rejection was important, my skills developed and I got better and better and better. It got down to 9 no's and 1 yes. So 1 in 10.
Brilliant.
1 in 10, that was a great statistic back those days when it was cold calling, knocking on doors, selling the worst things you could sell. So talk to me about the experiences that you've had in in the work you've done with the national teams that you work with, but also in the exposure you've had to various businesses along the way, in understanding how rejection impacts people and the tools that people can use to help get themselves over the initial pain that causes?
Sure. Well, first of all, I love that story. I think what a brilliant first boss you were lucky enough to have, Spencer, because that's a masterclass in terms of what intellectually we might know, but actually, as you say, he's teaching you psychologically and emotionally. You need to go through this learning experience. I the as you were saying it there, I was reminded of a phrase that I was given years ago where somebody said to me, "Success is a comma, not a full. Failure is a comma, not a full stop." And the reason that resonates with me is because a full stop, if you think of it in reading a sentence, you stop. There's nothing after that. Whereas a comma just says, "Take a breath." Take a breath, and then we'll go on to the rest of the sentence. And I think learning just to take a breath is where if you can then combine that with reflection, what can I do better? How do I improve on that? You can then go forward smarter for it. So that doesn't necessarily come from experience. I think it comes from experience plus reflection. So I'm sure you're like me. You know lots of really smart young people, but I bet you also know lots of stupid old people as well. And that's a good example where just because your like age doesn't confer wisdom on you, age plus reflection can confer wisdom if you're prepared to look at these failures in a forensic way to go, how do I do better next time? What do I learn from that? So I think the first thing is what your boss taught you was about reframing it. So don't see it as a full stop, see it as a comma, and then you move on to the 98th rejection, then you move on to the 97th, and you work down that list. So I think that's the first thing of just reframing it in a really effective way. I think another thing as well is that in organizations and teams, one of the things that I've seen done there is I've seen teams have like cock-up clubs or mistake clubs where they celebrate the mistakes, like the high five example that your boss was giving again, that you celebrate it rather than demonize people or berate them for it. I remember talking to one rugby coach once I worked with the team where I persuaded him to give his wingers. So when they did the statistical review, they look at how many yards you've run or how many tackles you've made and things like that. And for two of his players, I said, give them 5 mistakes a half. Because on the law of averages, they need to make 5 mistakes before they'll make one significant breakthrough in their position. So if you can almost tell them, I expect these mistakes, and these mistakes, you've almost got a target to make the 5 mistakes. Again, I was reminded of your boss saying to you, well, that's fine. We expect that. So you're going to drop the ball. You're going to get tackled. You're going to run into touch. And they're all part of what we've anticipated. So I think anticipating it and celebrating it can be really good. And then another example I've learned is it's a 2-word phrase that I'm sure lots of your listeners are familiar with. The phrase is psychological safety in teams. So psychological safety is a phrase that was coined by an organizational psychologist called Amy Edmondson back in the early 1990s. So she was doing a PhD at the time, Spencer, where she was looking at the best performing medical trusts and hospitals in the Boston seaboard area. And what she was finding didn't add up statistically. So she was going into what you'd regard as the best performing hospitals where recovery rates were highest and efficiencies were at their best. But she was finding that they had the highest number of near misses or reported incidents or effectively mistakes that were being made. And yet when she was going into hospitals that had sort of the worst KPIs and statistics, they had the lowest number of near misses and mistakes that are being made. Now, on the surface, that doesn't make sense. How can the best performing hospitals be making more mistakes than the worst performing? So that was what intrigued her to go and dig a little bit deeper. And what she found was that in the best performing hospitals, mistakes were being made, but people felt safe enough to put their hand up and say, I just made an error there. I just messed up. I did the equivalent of getting a no that your boss would be teaching. And rather than being demonized for that, they felt safe enough, psychologically safe within that culture, that people would see it as a comma, not a full stop, learn from it, and will avoid the mistake next time. What was happening in worse performing hospitals is people didn't feel safe enough to put their hands up and admit a mistake. So what they'd do is they'd bury it or pretend it hadn't happened, or point the finger of blame at somebody else, or see if there was any way they could palm it off elsewhere. So no learning was ever happening. A mistake in those cultures was literally a full stop and not a comma. So this idea of psychological safety has started to sort of catch on a lot in the last 10 or 15 years, inspired by Amy Edmondson. And and then Google did a study called Project Aristotle, where they looked at what are the features of high performing teams. And they found no common ground or not a lot of overlap, except for that one area of psychological safety, that every high performing team or culture has to have an environment that you were lucky enough to get in your first job, of mistakes being celebrated and recognized and rewarded and learnt from, rather than feeling demonized or feeling silly for having made them in the first place.
Makes me, after you say that, it makes me think about how lucky I am to have experienced that, because a lot of people haven't. And to get where I got, the part that played in my life was way bigger than I ever gave it credit for along
and it
the way.
sounds to me like, as you're describing it, I mean, one, it shaped the success that you've had in your own life, but it also shapes what was obviously the questions you were applying to your second daughter of, well, it's the equivalent of her getting the 99 no's, is maybe going through that horrible experience of feeling bullied. But what you were recognizing was, actually, this can be valuable if the reflection of it is done, and it's a wisdom that you can take with you into the rest of her life.
So I just want to stop here and talk about the people that enabled this podcast to be possible. Organizations such as SmartCast, who are solving the problem of food security in the world, have supported this podcast because they believe in the mission that I'm on. When you understand the work that they do at trying to solve the problem with this massive population growth we've been having over the years, and providing a way of bringing food safely to everybody, it really is something I admire. As well as SmartCast, we're really lucky to have partnered with Arabian Business, where not only can you see our content on YouTube and listen to it on the podcast, but you can also see it on the Arabian Business channels. So big thanks to those guys for backing us, supporting us, and allowing us to share our content with a bigger and bigger audience. And lastly, thank you to Najahi Events, who have been sponsoring us now on the podcast for over a year. Najahi bring motivational speakers to the region to help inspire, educate, and motivate you to achieve better success and live a better life. In the world of sports, we've seen a lot in recent times. So let's stick with what's going on at the moment. We've seen a lot of stuff that can mess with people's heads going on recently. So we'll just highlight them. Let's take Abu Dhabi Lewis Hamilton as an example of what happened. Let's take Roman Abramovich and the Chelsea squad and the manager. We can obviously take Manchester United because that's constantly talked about. But maybe we can also talk about what someone like Frank Lampard's going through right now with a team that should never be there. But then on the flip side, what must have happened at Newcastle for things to change there? Because before that happened, I think there was a statistic that said a team in that position after Christmas has never not been relegated, or only once in history but they've come flying out of that problem and are in a straight place now. So let's take one at a time. Let's talk Lewis Hamilton. Okay, you've got a guy, he's 7-time world champion, hugely successful. Clearly, he leaned into what happened to him as a kid about how he had a target on his back as a boy when he was racing, and their dad had no money and they were making ends meet. Gone on to achieve huge success, and then he's had something stolen from him.
Yeah.
How do you process that?
Well, again, I mean, it's a really fascinating example, but what I think it shows is that I feel a lot of what I often talk about, you could describe it as the application of common sense, and you're trying to make it common practice. So there's nothing new in particular around it. So back in the 1950s, there was a psychologist called Albert Bandura that was at Stanford University, and he identified a really significant factor of people having success. in their own lives. He called it self-efficacy. So if you have low self-efficacy, what that means is you're quick to point the finger of blame. You see yourself as a victim. That's not fair. That's not right. You did this to me. I feel cheated, that you've stolen that from me. If you have high levels of self-efficacy, you go, this is on me. What can I do? So, for example, if you were in the world of sales and you don't get the job that you apply for, low self-efficacy says, "Oh, they didn't like me. They were biased against me. It wasn't fair. The cards were weighted against me." If you've got high self-efficacy, you say, "You know what? Maybe I wasn't good enough in that interview. Maybe my levels of preparation could have been better. Maybe I could have been more passionate and enthusiastic." So, just in terms of the language that you use is an indication of it. And I suspect that someone like Lewis Hamilton might initially would have felt wounded by it. I'm sure he would. But then I'm sure that quite quickly he went into that high self-efficacy. What could I have done? Why did I leave that race right down to that final lap to determine the success? Why did I even rely on it going down to a final race? What could I have done better? How could I have improved it earlier on in the season to make sure that the points difference was higher? And I suspect that most of his reflections would have been what he could have done better, rather than spending too much time feeling aggrieved or wronged by it, because that doesn't serve anybody or anything. And I think the fact that Mercedes didn't appeal against it, it was a really interesting example of how they moved on from it quite quickly. They didn't see themselves as being victims or having something stolen. They saw it as what could they have done better. And I suspect that we'll see that sort of reaction later on in the rest of in the season that starts this weekend. I think we'll see that. I mean, there's a couple of really interesting racing drivers that I've had the good fortune enough to meet, or some of the team bosses. So Toto Wolff, Lewis Hamilton's boss himself, sat down with him. He was a guy that was very much focused on the process rather than the outcome. Have we done everything right ourselves? Let's focus on what we can do and what we've done right, rather than necessarily measure our success on the outcome of whether we win a title or not. So he gave us a really memorable interview on the High Performance Podcast, Spencer, where he sat down and he said when he first came into Mercedes, the very first thing he challenged was the dirty coffee cups that were in the reception area. And there was a day-old copy of the Daily Mail. And he said, you might sit there thinking, what does coffee cups and an old Daily Mail tell us? And he went, well, it's about standards. It's about attention to detail. And if one of our non-negotiable behaviours is that we pay attention to the small things that we can control, the reception area is just as important as the pit lane or the car. So that's what makes me confident that I suspect Lewis Hamilton is in a culture where they wouldn't have spent a long time feeling like victims, but they'd have spent an awful long time working out what they could have done better during the whole season to avoid it going down to that last lap. I mean, I often say this to teams that I work with, that when they complain about referees, a line I use with them is, you should be better than the worst referee in performance. So even if the referee's having a stinker, you should still focus on all the things that you can influence that mean that you will be better than even the worst decision that referee will make against you. But if you're relying on a referee's decision as to whether you're going to win or lose, maybe you haven't done enough yourself in your preparation, that you're almost leaving it down to the fate of whether that referee's having a good day or not.
Good point. And when you then look forward at Chelsea after going through, I mean, this is unprecedented, isn't it? For a team to go through something as dramatic as that, I think, anyway. Maybe not as dramatic, but in recent time anyway. So, we can lean into Sir Matt Busby and the job that he did all those years ago after the terrible plane accident and stuff like that. But what does someone like Thomas Tuchel have to do to galvanize those people, those players, that whole business? Really, it's not just about the players on the pitch; it's about the tea lady, everybody else that's with it. How do you galvanize people? Is it kind of like right? The chips are down, our backs are against the wall. How are we gonna come out fighting, guys? Or are we gonna curl up into a ball? What do you think?
I think it's a brilliant question. I think in terms of what's happened, politically, I think what Tuchel will be talking about is that famous phrase, control the controllables. Because ultimately, for him and his players, nothing has really changed in terms of, like, nobody from that playing group has left the squad. So politically, that's all going on outside of their world. But for them, they're the same group that was still in place 2 weeks ago before all this happened. So I think Tuchel will be using this as a opportunity to circle the wagons a little bit, to say, let's block out the noise, because that the noise of what's happening with Abramovich is outside our control. So there's no point in us investing our time and energy to talk about that. Let's focus on what we can do. So I think it'll be that sort of siege mentality that Alex Ferguson was so good at doing, that everybody wants to see us fail, that we've got lots of reasons why we can fail, but let's go out there and have each other's back. Let's defend each other. Let's make sure that we do our job to the best that we can to achieve our objectives. And I think stuff like what you mentioned about, I read a stat today that Chelsea have got 1,000 members of staff, and a lot of them will be on salaries that are nowhere near what we assume the playing group are on. So I think they'll be using that message to say, let's do it as a cause for them as well. Let's go. We're representing the tea lady. We're representing the stewards or the staff that in the club shop that have lost our job. We almost have a duty. So he'll be giving them that sense of mission of, let's focus on what we can do, doing the best we can, have each other's backs, and we'll do it as a representative of those members of staff that have lost their jobs, that are going to be severely affected. So I think that's how we'll be playing this internally at the moment.
It potentially, if they come out the other side of this, it potentially can be a game changer for them. Okay, of course they're successful as it is, but when you galvanize a group of people in adversity like that, and they really do come together, all of a sudden it becomes a
Massively,
family.
yeah. So I'll give you a really good example of that. That when we interviewed, like, one of my favorite interviews that we've done was with a guy called Sia Khaleesi, who's the captain of the South African Springboks, the rugby union team, and he was appointed. So he is a captain, but historically he was the first black captain in the Springboks' 130-year history. And he was appointed by Razzie Erasmus when they were in some pretty dire circumstances. I think they'd lost something like 12 out of 30 test matches. The squad was seen in disarray, and Khaleesi was appointed as the captain of them. So, but he came in and said that he wanted to base his captaincy on a Zulu phrase called Ubuntu, which translates as "I am because you are." So the point is that I can only be the person I am if you're being authentic and being the person you are. So that was the general gist of it. So one of the messages that he did, or one of the exercises to galvanize the group and show that this was a new era, was he asked every member of the squad to bring in 5 pictures of the people closest to them, that when they pulled the Springboks jersey on, that was who they represented. That was who they played for. So you could find out, who are you in this Ubuntu philosophy? So all the players, as you'd expect, Spencer, brought in pictures of, like, parents, partners, first coaches, children, things like that, except for one. One player called Makazola Mampimpi turned up, and he brought 5 photos of himself on holiday. Now, Khaleesi thought that this guy was trying to subvert the process or make fun of it, but in the spirit of "I am because you are," give him his moment. And when Mampimpi stood up in front of the playing group, he revealed that he'd brought 5 photos of himself because he was an orphan, that he'd lost both his parents by the age of 10. He was responsible for a brother and sister, and both of them had died by the age of 15 in an accident and because of illness. So the message that he gave to the Springbok team was, "I don't have anybody. So in other words, you now become my family." And Khaleesi told us that the message in that team, the way that galvanized them was, he said, "I would fight for a teammate, but I'd die for a member of my family." And suddenly this guy was standing in front of us saying, "You are my family because I don't have anybody else." And he claims that that message galvanized them to come together, to develop these strong bonds in their relationships, that meant that when they found themselves in the World Cup final in Yokohama in Japan, there was no way they were ever going to lose. And they weren't going to lose because they had these relationships that had been built so strongly. if it's channeled correctly, it can actually galvanize a group of people, bond them closer together, deepen those ties, and strengthen it. If you come through that together, yeah, you're right. It can be rocket. It can be rocket fuel.
Oh man, that's just so powerful. Imagine that one thing can take a whole group of people, because you can imagine
Oh,
being in that changing room, can't you? When he sits there, you could just that's just that is
yeah.
really moving in that moment, and no more
You
words
don't
are
need
then
to say
needed,
anything.
are
There's
they?
no gimmick. And the thing is, there's no gimmick involved in that. That's just somebody coming and making themselves really vulnerable in front of 29 of their other colleagues that are saying, this is me for like warts and all. Like, I think you'd either have to be a sociopath or an idiot to look at that and think, I'll make fun of you, or I'll ridicule you in that. I think most people with a degree of
Yeah,
empathy would go, I somehow now feel closer to you. And that's a good example of that earlier answer about psychological safety, that you have to feel safe and you have to trust the people in that room to want to make yourself so vulnerable. But when you can get that, that's where the bonds of the relationship go so much deeper than just the surface level.
amazing. I love that. Right, quickly, Everton.
Well, I mean, from what I understand, I think Everton are a club where culturally they're a bit of a mess. So I think expecting a coach to come in and fix it in a short term measure, like what Frank Lampard's being asked to do, is nigh on impossible. So I think what they'll need to do with him there is allow him just to come in and apply the process to it. I think at the moment it'll be so it so to explain it in more detail, what I'd like a nice way when you talk about a culture of a club. So too often, Spencer, it's easy for people to say, "Oh, there's a bad culture at Everton. The culture's toxic," and it doesn't actually mean a great deal. What's more helpful is to say, "Well, what type of
Hmm.
culture do they have?" And to answer that
Hmm.
question, there's research done by two guys from Stanford University called Barron and Hannon. They studied this over 25 years. And what they found is traditionally, you throw a group of people together, a culture will always emerge. It's the type of culture that's most interesting. And there's one of 5 different types you can get. So some organizations have a star culture where you just throw loads of money at it. You invest in the best facilities you can, and you hope that all that talent comes together and delivers spectacular success. So think of somewhere like Real Madrid or Paris Saint-Germain for that. You can then have an autocratic culture, which is where you've got one powerful leader that sets the tone. So it's my way or the highway. So think of someone like Chelsea for the last 17 years under Abramovich with the hire and fire of coaches. The third type of culture is a bureaucracy, where you've got policies, procedures, rules, and regulations coming out of your ears. So change is slow and it's ponderous. The fourth type is an engineering culture. So you bring in people because they're technically skilled at a job. You don't worry about how they behave. It's more about can they do a job in a technical aspect. But then the fifth type of culture is a commitment culture. And what a commitment culture is built on is a really clear sense of purpose. This is our mission, and a really clear set of behaviours. These are the rules of membership. Now, what the evidence says is in this research, if you want high performance over a sustained period, commitment cultures are your best guarantee of achieving it. The others can wax and wane, but a commitment culture tends, on average, according to the Barron and Hannon research, tends to be about 22% more successful than those other types. Now, the reason I reference that is if you think of somewhere like Everton, Everton are a mishmash of different cultures. They've got a few superstars, they've gone down the route of employing autocratic leaders. They've got a board that's applying bureaucratic principles. So what you've got is a mishmash of different cultures that are fighting to be dominant, and that's where people then just use that shorthand of you've got a toxic culture. So I think what Frank Lampard, and I've been lucky enough to meet Frank and interview him on this, is he buys into this idea of so much of the aspects of it being a commitment culture, having really clear standards of behaviour and a really clear sense of purpose or a vision of how he wants a team to play. So I think now that you've brought him in, you need to just allow him the time and space to go and implement that and be patient with it. So I accept that he'll have a firefighting job on his hands in the short term, but you don't judge him on this short-term results. You give him the patience to go in and put in place foundations that are going to help you be successful over a long term. So Alex Ferguson was brilliant at this. He had a great phrase that he said, we play for today, but we plan for tomorrow. So it was always that if you're patient with a leader like that, Ferguson claims that one of the key measures of his success was that he could plan in 4-year cycles, whereas most managers could only plan in 1-year cycles, because you're always firefighting. Whereas when he could make a decision, say in year 2, to get rid of a player, say Jaap Stam or David Beckham, not because they weren't necessarily effective in year 2, but he knew by year 4 he'd have to replace them anyway. So you might as well start the process of evolution rather than constantly being reactive. So I think that if Everton can get through this period of firefighting that they'll need to avoid relegation, then allow Lampard the space and time to plan in a longer cycle, I think that he'll put in place foundation stones that will allow them to thrive.
I want to take it back to you now because I want to get some more questions answered.
No, it's all right.
I'm
Go on, I'm
conscious
enjoying
of
it.
time. Can from all the stuff I watch, I read, I consume of yours, we're always talking, or in the main, you're talking about stuff external to you, situations that you've learned about, studies that you've done, and for me, the fact that you have such an interest in this subject means that the fact that you don't talk a lot about your experiences in the same way means that needs I think we need more of that out in the public domain. So I hope you don't mind. But I've got 10 questions here. 6 of them are mine, and 4 of them are from my audience that I asked to ask questions. So I'm gonna go through them and I'll answer them the best way you see fit. If you had to meet someone who was struggling to show up at their maximum potential, what would be your first step for getting them out of their rut?
That's a great question. I can summarize that in 3 simple words. Success leaves clues. So what I would do with anybody that was in a bit of a rut, the first question I'd say is, let's define what success looks like for you. So it might be the time you were happiest. It might be the time you hit your sales target at work. It might be the time when you just felt really good about yourself. That's for you to define the parameters of what success looks like. And once we've agreed on what the success is, I would then say, now let's do a proper review of it. Let's analyze it. So let's go back. What was happening in that period of time? What were you talking, who were you hanging around with? What were you reading? What were you doing? What were your habits? There's 3 reasons why I would ask those questions. First of all, confidence is built on evidence. So I'm not going to ask you to do something that you're not capable of. First of all, we're going to go and say, let's find the evidence of when you've already been successful. So what we're now going to do is try and do that more consistently, do the behaviors and the traits that led you to be successful in the past. We're going to do more of it more consistently. So first of all, you should be confident in what we're talking about. Secondly, it's inclusive. So I'm inviting you into the conversation. I'm not trying to be some expert from outside your world making judgments. That's not my job. We're including you, and I can maybe guide you with some of the questions I ask, but you're the one that's going to be in charge of that process. And then thirdly as well, who doesn't have an opinion on success? It's like that famous quote that, failure is a bastard, but success has got many fathers. So it's easy when we've gone wrong to go, it wasn't me, it was that. And nobody wants to own it, but everybody goes, oh, well, I know why success happened. So I'm inviting you. So you will have something to contribute. So if I was working with anybody that was having a bit of a slump, that's the first place I'd start. Let's define success and let's do a proper analysis of it. And we'll find the clues that will enable you to be successful in the future.
Perfect. Okay. What has been the hardest setback for you and how did you approach it?
I've had so many, so it's almost like choosing them. I think one that I had was that when I made a decision years ago that this is nearly 20 years ago, that I thought I needed to get a proper job. So none of my family, as I explained my background, nobody had ever had sort of like a proper job in the corporate world. And when I was sort of leaving university, I said to my girlfriend at the time, she's my wife now, I said, I think I need to get a proper job. And she was like, well, you're not really qualified to do anything in the real world in terms of, so I so long story short, I applied for different jobs, and a company called Unilever were really good to take me on and employ me because what I was saying to them was I love, my passion is about creating high performing culture. So they said, well, we have a role for that in human resources. So I got a job in human resources, but I was so naive about how the corporate world worked because I just didn't. I like, as I say, my parents hadn't worked in it. I didn't have friends. I wasn't from a background where people did sort of corporate white collar jobs. So I thought that my background was that if a company didn't like you, they could just say to you, get out. Like, and that was it. They'd pay you up for the end of the day and they'd kick you out. I didn't know that like employment law meant that that wasn't the case. So I got a job and like, I promised them, I said, I'll work my socks off and I'll do the best I can. That was all. That was all I promised. So every couple of years, I get a call off my boss and he'd say, I want to see you tomorrow. And I'd go in and for the first year, before I learned how this works, I thought he was going to sack me. So I went in anticipating that he was going to say, thanks for your time, but you need to leave. We've discovered that you don't know what you're doing. And instead, they promoted me. Instead, so I got a promotion. And then, so for 7 years, I kept getting promoted until eventually I got promoted to my level of incompetence, where I found myself not doing the kind of work I wanted to do, which was going out there. I found myself sat in boardrooms and meeting rooms talking about the kind of work I wanted to be doing, but not actually getting the chance to do it. But at the same time, Spencer, I was getting paid a salary that I could never have imagined getting when I was a kid growing up. I had a company car and I had all the things that were making me soft and comfortable. And yet I was doing a job that I was thinking, I don't want to do this. This isn't where I should be spending my time. And the way I phrased it was, I mentally resigned 18 months before I had the courage to follow through and actually submit a resignation. But that 18 months, I remember being sat there thinking I was a fraud and being sort of a little bit ashamed of myself for not having the courage of my convictions or for being a bit of a sellout. And I remember one day I was in South Africa, I was in Durban, and I remember looking out of the window onto the Indian Ocean in this boardroom we were in. And I remember thinking I'd do anything to be outside there and not sat in here because I knew I was in the wrong place for me. Like, it was a great company, so I'm not speaking anything ill of them, but I knew that I wasn't in the right place for me. And I remember we were debating margarine sales in the region, right? And they dipped. And I remember when it came on the agenda thinking, there's not one part of me that gives a shit about this conversation. Like there's not one atom of my being that gives a shit. But as the conversation was like creeping death, as it was coming round to me, I was seeing like colleagues like looking crestfallen and devastated and shaking their head in bemusement of it. And I remember thinking, what am I going to do when it comes to me? Am I going to have the courage of my conviction to say, I don't care. It really doesn't impact me. But I didn't. And I sort of joined in with everybody else and pretending to be utterly devastated by it. And that was the evening that I eventually went, I'm not doing this for the next 30 years of my life. I'm not being a fraud. I feel like I'm betraying myself and where I'm from. So that was the catalyst for me to hand my resignation in. But I'd gone through about 18 months where I knew I should have done it. I just didn't have the courage to go through it. So that's my answer to that one.
What did it feel like the day you put it in?
And I'll tell you, like, this next bit doesn't reflect on me at all well, right? But in the spirit of honesty here, that when I was in that world, I was a gobshite, if that phrase translates. So I'd say things like, I'd have the company car and I'd say, it doesn't matter to me. It's nice to have it, but I don't care. The day that I resigned and the day they came to take it off me, right, I remember being stood there and I was disgusted at how upset I was. So I was disgusted with myself that I actually felt upset that this car I'd pretended not to care about, I now didn't have it. And that was the moment then I went, mate, you've lost your head. you've been lost for too long. If you're upset about that, that's a reflection of the person I don't want to be. And that was when I forced myself to really go back and have a long look at myself and sort of come up with my own. So I use the phrase regularly on the podcast of non-negotiables. I came up with my own non-negotiables, and one of them was that I'll never do a job just that I don't believe in, just because it pays well. I wouldn't do a job that I can look at and think I can make a positive difference here, and I can enjoy it. And if it doesn't fulfill one of those two criteria, it's about having the courage of your convictions to remember that moment when they took the car off me and gone, you're a sellout. And that's not the sort of person I wanted to be.
Really interesting. So that leads on to the next question, actually, and maybe not necessarily relating to this, but in your experience, when you think about quitting, what are your thoughts on quitting? Should people quit? Should they give up? Do people give up too easily, do you think?
Sometimes, yeah, I think so. Like one of the things that I do when I go and work with sports teams is sometimes you look at the whole culture, the whole environment, and one of the ones that I often say is get those motivational quotes down off the walls, because like one of the famous ones is winners never quit and quitters never win, and I always go sometimes they do though. Sometimes it's the right thing to do. So what message are you giving to people by putting quotes up? It's far more helpful to say these are the rules that these are the behavioural rules that we expect from you, rather than give those sort of bland motivational quotes. So I think sometimes, yeah, if it's not a sense of purpose, it'll feel like a job. If you're not doing it because you're passionate or you care about it, it'll feel like a burden rather than a pleasure to do it. And I think if that then starts to eat, and that's not to make any judgment, lots of us have to do those kind of jobs where we feel obliged to do them. But I think if it takes away some of your peace, whether that's your physical well-being or your mental well-being, or if you're sacrificing other factors that are important to you, maybe family time or time that you spend doing things that you enjoy, maybe then there is a question of, can I find something better or more appropriate? So it'll always be contextual. So I'm not trying to give any hard and fast rules there, Spencer, but I think let's get away from this culture of thinking that we have to somehow be resilient, even in the face of intolerable circumstances. Sometimes it's like quitting. Even that word has got negative connotations, but sometimes just choosing to take a different path rather than see it as quitting can be helpful for us.
I think your previous answer there about what you did quitting was the
Yeah,
right
exactly,
thing to do.
yeah.
So that's just such a good example, isn't it? It was the right thing to do for your soul. But
that's where, if we reframe it, so on one level, you could say, well, I quit the corporate world. Well, yes, I did. Or I could say, I took a different path that made me happier. So you could view it, it's the same incident, but you could view it in two very different ways. You could give it a negative connotation, or you could give it a more helpful connotation. And that's why I think maybe reframing that term quitting and maybe seeing it as taking an alternative pathway can be more helpful for people and make it easier for them to make that choice if they need to.
Absolutely. I agree. Okay, so on the podcast, which is hugely successful, are there recurring themes that you see regarding high performance to the guests you've had on?
I mean, it's a really interesting question because we wrote a book about it that came out in December last year, where the idea was to see if we could find some common traits, because everybody's like, to give you an example, we've done 105 interviews with people from the world of sport, business and the arts. And we always start with the first question of what is high performance to you? We've yet to have a consistent answer to that question of 105. Yeah, there's not been one answer where you go, oh yeah, that's the same as him.
Do you know what though? I think people can't sometimes answer that though. I listen to people answering it, and I think they're trying to. They know that question's coming, and some of them are because they've listened to the podcast. So okay, I know that's coming, so I better make sure I've got an answer for it. And then, like Lando, for example, he was just. Exactly. Do you agree with me?
But even so, they might have listened to other episodes and they've not taken somebody's definition and gone, "Oh, I love that. That one speaks to me." And I think that's the point that
Fair point.
What that tells you is that there's no one definition. There's no one way of high performance. There's no sort of finish line that says if you get here, you are a high performer. Everybody's got their own definitions for it. So, like a really good example of this is that if you take two of the best rugby players of all time, Johnny Wilkinson and Dan Carter, we've had both of them on. Now, you could say they both reached a similar point in their careers of being universally regarded as the best players in their position in their era. And yet, Johnny Wilkinson described how he'd arrived at that place from a place of fear and from struggle and sacrifice. And yet, Dan Carter described arriving at that same place through a sense of enjoyment and passion and love for the sport. So they both got to the same destination without taking the same route there. So the reason I mention that is that trying to then find some common characteristics of them wasn't particularly easy. But I think you can sum it up in three areas that all of them seem to invest time in understanding their route. The first one is the idea of mindset. So some of the stuff we've spoken about earlier on in our chat today, Spencer, like taking responsibility, not having that victim mentality of taking accountability, coping under pressure, being relentless. These are all mental traits that they've learnt ways of developing them. The second area that they focus on then is about behaviours, high performance behaviours. So the first thing is they find what they're good at. They play to their strengths, not try to mitigate for their weaknesses. So a really good example of that was when we interviewed Jo Malone, the perfumier. So she spoke about how she left school at 14 years old with no qualification to her name. She was a dyslexic. She was from a broken home. And she said not one teacher at that school knew that she was spending her evenings and weekends working in a beautician's, creating these fabulous concoctions. It was only when she left school did she find an environment where she could take this innate sense of smell that she had and make it a superpower. So she played to her strengths. And then I think they all have non-negotiables, things that they won't compromise on. And then they're consistent in applying them. So it's about success is often about doing the simple thing consistently well for a long period of time. So I think those behaviors are traits. And then the third area is surrounding yourself with the right people. So the idea of high performing teams.
Tell me, you've had
Fabulous,
Nims Die on the show. I've had him on the show too. And when I climbed Mount Elbrus last year, I bumped into him on the blooming mountain too. Yeah, couldn't believe it.
Yeah. You know what you're doing. I'll follow you. Yeah.
Literally walked into each other. But okay, you could argue that what he achieved on those 14 peaks is probably, you could argue, I'll say that again, that's probably at the very peak of the highest of performance, physically, mentally. I wonder how someone like Nims compares himself to a Johnny Wilkinson, for example, whether he because he tells a story about how he's 5'4", and he is 5'4". I've got a photo with him. And he's tiny, joining the special boat services. He's with 6'4" guys with blue eyes and blonde hair. He doesn't even understand the humor of these guys, and he's having to learn about the culture. But that he performed at such an extreme and dangerous level. How he interprets Johnny Wilkinson's success, whether he looks at that and goes, "That's high performance," or whether he says, "You can't beat me," or "You can't get close." I
think what I've seen a lot of these guys do is they don't engage in comparison culture. So they don't look at Johnny Wilkinson and go, "You're better than me," or "Worse than me." I think if they look at them, they look at what can I learn from them without feeling inferior or diminished by them. So like when we spoke to Nims, he had this great phrase that I've used it so often, where he said, "Your ability to be world class at anything depends on how long you're willing to be shit at it for." And it was like, that's amazing, because that shows you how it goes back to that learner's mindset. You're always open to new ideas, and you'll try things, you'll fail, you'll reflect, you'll try again, and you'll go back smarter. So I often think that guys like him are not looking at Johnny Wilkinson and going, "He's better than me," but he might be saying, "How did he cope in that situation better than what I have done? And what can I learn from him?" But without diminishing his own achievements. And I think that is a consistent trait from all of them, that they're open to learning from other people without necessarily feeling a need to compare themselves.
So does that level of success mean that along the way they learned to manage, either had their ego kicked out of them, or they learned to manage their egos, or they were trained to understand their ego,
Yeah,
their
I
ego was
think,
going to damage their
and
progress?
again, I don't think there's one way. Maybe some of it was they were knocked out of this idea of being self-aggrandizing. Maybe some of it was they just realised that it wasn't helpful, or maybe from a child these kind of messages had been reinforced into them. So I think again that's where everybody's got their own unique journey, their own unique thumbprint of how they've got there. But I definitely think that I'll give you a really simple example of it that. We interviewed Dylan Hartley, who he was just months after he'd retired from being the England Rugby Union captain. Now, when we spoke to him about his career as a rugby player, he was eloquent, he was smart, and he'd go into real detail. And then I asked him, I said, he'd just become a father for a second time. And I said, how are you going to take these lessons that you've learned in your rugby career and apply them to parenthood? And the immediate response he gave us, Spencer, was, I don't know, I've never been a dad before. Now, you could say, well, what does that tell you? But what it showed you is, as soon as he went outside his realm of knowledge, he adopted the beginner's mindset again. So he wasn't then, like I'm sure you've met lots of people, like I have, that say like they've been successful in one domain of their life, say they've made a lot of money in business. They then make pronouncements about politics or about sport or about every other area of their life with the same confidence that they might have done about their area of business expertise. And you go, whoa, hang on a minute. Just because you're an expert there doesn't make you an expert in every aspect. And I think what I've seen with so many of our high performers is they've got the humility to know when they've gone outside their range of expertise, and they immediately take that beginner's mindset of what can you teach me? What do I need to learn? What do I not know? So that they can take that on board and apply it.
That is so important. I hadn't thought about that before.
Go on.
Okay, 2 questions before we finish. Maybe 3, but 2 definitely. Okay. What's the best advice you've ever received from a podcast guest?
Wow. Okay. I'm going to go back to Sia Khaleesi. And he was the first guest we had that said something that really resonated and reverberated through me, where he just said, he doesn't compromise on being kind. He said, I don't compromise on being kind to anybody. Now, bear in mind, this is a guy that his nickname is the Bear, to give you an idea of how physically imposing he is. And yet he was a man there preaching kindness and understanding and empathy. And I remember, like, that's something that I've had to learn the hard way of starting to do that. But it really sort of reinforced a message to me that it's like, don't compromise on this stuff of just be a decent person, be kind, do what you can to make a difference to people. And to hear him saying it from his position of being the world champion, the captain of the world champions, I felt was really quite profound.
Really profound. In that moment, hearing that must have meant, when you think about it, it just must have meant something, because it had been delivered. It probably would have been delivered.
Well, the
really
origins of why we got him on, I'll tell you, it's a bit of a funny story, but a friend of mine called Tom worked down at the Stormers in Cape Town with him. And me and Tom sort of trade messages, or we'll share ideas or things like that. And Tom had said to me a couple of years ago, he said, you need to get Sia onto the podcast. So I came back and said, why? Like, why do you, apart from that he's a great rugby player, why do you think his story would resonate? And he said, he's the best hugger I've ever met in my life. So I texted him out, sorry, explain what you mean. And he said he gives the best hugs out of anybody you'll ever meet. So I said, so I phoned him up and I said to him, this is such an intriguing response, Tom. Tell me what you mean. And he said, this guy just gives these beautiful, big, warm bear hugs. And he said, but the reason I say it is, he says, everybody gets it. So if you're the cleaner in the training ground at the Stormers, you get the same bear hug that the president of South Africa gets when he turns up to meet him. He said he doesn't discriminate. Everybody gets treated with this warmth, this decency, and this kindness. So when he told me this, I thought, this is intriguing. And then when we spoke to him, and like you say, he was soft and he was gentle. And yet when he delivers it, I don't compromise on kindness in any situation. If I can't be kind, I remove myself from the environment. that is fantastic, because I think sometimes this idea of toxic masculinity, or even the phrases of having to front up, or assuming that life is about being on the front foot or bombastic or aggressive, hearing somebody like him preach that different alternative way, to me was fabulous.
Brilliant. Okay, last one. This is not my question. This is actually somebody in my office has asked this question. It's been a heavy couple of years with the pandemic, various world events, and now the war in Ukraine. Given your expertise and knowledge within the field of sports psychology, are there any specific coping strategies you'd recommend which could help the current climate feel more manageable?
I mean, it's a brilliant question. I think what I would do there is I'd quote Jeff Bezos. That Jeff Bezos was once asked the question of, what do you think is the technology that's going to disrupt the world in the next 10 years? And he said, isn't it far more helpful to say what's going to stay the same in the next 10 years rather than what's going to change? And the reason I'd quote that in answer to the question is, rather than say all the things that have gone on, so has the world changed, this hybrid way of working, the war and the disruption that's going, we can look at all that and we can feel a panic, a sense of ambiguity or uncertainty. But instead I'd say, let's have a look at what's not going to change regardless of all these factors. And what we know is there's effectively three things that all of us as human beings need to be able to thrive wherever we are or do what we're doing. The first thing is we need to have a sense of belonging. We need to feel a sense of community with other people. We need to surround ourselves with people that we enjoy, that light us up and that make a difference to us. So the biggest predictor of mental health issues such as depression is loneliness, when we feel disconnected or isolated. So we need to tap into this idea of make sure you're surrounding yourself with people that you want to belong to. The second one is we need to have a sense of value. We need to feel that we're doing what we're good at, that we can find a way of playing to our strengths, that exercising our passions, showing off what we're good at, because that, again, it speaks to a sense of competence. But it's more than competence. It's about doing things that we love. And then the third one is we need to have a sense of control. We need to focus on the stuff that we can influence. So this is all, these three areas, if people listening to this are interested in exploring it, they come from a research of two guys called Edward Deasy and Richard Ryan, and it's called the self-determination theory, that when these three areas of control, belonging and value are being addressed, we give ourselves the best chance of being the best version that we are. And regardless of what's going on in the world or what has gone on, those three factors, we're not going to evolve fast enough that those three factors are ever going to become redundant. So I'd encourage that anyone listening to this, see how you can shape and structure a life for yourself that gives you a sense of belonging with the people that matter, a chance to do the things that you love doing, and the control and the experience of getting to exercise your own free will and do it where and when suits you.
Amazing. And one last comment and question. I would do my podcast for free. I love it so much that if my job full time was to interview a couple of people every day a week, 5 days a week, and learn about people's stories, backgrounds, histories, why they think the way they think, etc.
Definitely.
Do you have the same passion for it?
Rather than just say that and think that that's an easy remark to make because I should do it. I was doing this stuff for free for a long time, so it's not just somebody saying it and not having to back it up. When I wrote my first book, for example, I wrote a book called Liquid Thinking. And I wrote it when I was doing that job in the corporate world. I never wrote a book to be published. I wrote it for the guys in a factory that I'd worked with just outside of Liverpool and helped them turn it round. So I wrote the book in my own time for free. I published it myself because it was only ever for them. I paid for it myself and I gave it away to all of them. And then I wrote my second book for free, and then I wrote my third book, and I kept just self-publishing it and giving it away to people that I liked and admired. So I did that for the first 6 years of I wouldn't describe it as a career, but of the books that I did in terms of the writing. And I did it just because I loved doing it, that I can't, like people had asked me about TV shows and they'd say, have you seen that show? I say, no, sorry, the last 6 years I've spent my head on my spare time immersed in researching or trying to write the next book. So it really was a passion that I've been lucky enough to be able to make into a living. And yeah, I'm absolutely in the same place as you, Spencer. I just feel an immense amount of privilege to be able to do what I do and with the podcast and to meet yourself and to just sit and chat with you. I just feel so incredibly lucky. So yes, I would do it for free because I have done it for free. It's been a real pleasure to get to meet you, and also, I mean, thank you for the time that you put into sort of researching and asking such smart, incisive, and really thought-provoking questions. Thank you.
No problem at all. Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank
Damian Hughes. Well, what a fantastic guest Damian was. I mean, I've just learned so much in this time we've spent with each other, and I'm sure that you've taken some great takeaways from it too. From his humble beginnings, the fact that he didn't really fit academically, to go on and achieve the success he's achieved in the world of psychology and high performance is really something quite remarkable. Damian is a true gentleman, kind and giving with his time, and that's something that you can't say for everybody. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to him today, and I hope that you got some great takeaways from the show too. Did you enjoy the show? Well, if you did, great. You got more episodes up there you can click on. You can get to see more episodes of the show. But if you click over here, you can subscribe. That's something I'd really like you to do, because if you subscribe, then every single time I produce content, you're going to be the first person to see it. So please do me a favor, click over there, get subscribed so we can go on this journey together. I'll see you on the next episode.